Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our new media roundtable on Britain's approach to soft power. This is going to be live on the New America's website and on the Washington Note, so welcome all the viewers and readers of the Washington Note and the New America Foundation's website to watch this. Now, we're going to have a quick and tight schedule because we're going to go exactly for 1 hour and we're going to end exactly on time. Our guests have to run literally at 4. And so I'm going to do a quick introduction of them, but this is going to be co-moderated by Steve from Berlin and I from here. And I'm actually going to let Steve do a lot of the heavy lifting and just try to help him out from this end. But I'm Amjad Atallah. I'm the director of the Middle East Task Force, which I co-direct with my good friend Daniel Levy here at the New America Foundation. And of course, you know Steve. He's the director of the American Strategies Program at the New America Foundation and the publisher of the much read and much talked about Washington Note. And also often seen on many of the American news programs, as well as Jazeera and other networks, which I actually get to see him on. I was actually amazed at Steve's ability he was about to be doing an event with Chuck Hagel only a few hours later, and he planned this big stunt where he was going to wear a mask and everything, pretending to be Joe Biden. And I went home to change into a suit to go watch that event, and he was on the Riz Khan show on Jazeera English for an hour talking about Iraq just a few hours before he did that. So your ability to be versatile and jump from event to event still amazes me.
Well, thank you so much, Amjad. There is a little bit of a lag in time, and hopefully we'll be interactive. First of all, I just wanted to say welcome to Martin Davidson and to Raoul Shah and the British Council. I don't know if Andrew Neil is in the room, but your teammates here in Washington do an outstanding job. And talking about versatile, you know, the British Council is the largest cultural organization in the world, celebrating its 75th anniversary. And when I heard that Martin and Raoul were going to be in town, I wanted to do something along this line, not all with people with coats and ties and looking as formal as all of you guys do long distance, but I do think that the role of the Council and the whole notion of practically applying what we've loosely begun to call smart power in a lot of ways, the British Council has been doing for a long time, and as we struggle with these ideas in the United States, I thought this exchange could be quite good. I am going to do a lot of listening here. I think we ought to go around the room quickly. I'll introduce ourselves because there are quite a number of people who are participating and watching online, and we should just go around the room. But I just wanted to say words of welcome, and thanks very much to Amjad Atallah and my team as well for putting this together. I'm tired of missing the cool stuff we do at New America when I'm on foreign trips, so I figure we ought to begin using Ustream and Skype and just kind of dealing with putting away this distance issue, which is why I'm doing this eccentric thing of weighing in from abroad. But why don't we go quickly around the room, Amjad, and have everybody say name, rank, and serial number, and then get to the guts of our discussion with Martin.
Sounds good. Ed, why don't we start with you? Oh, and if I could ask, could everybody please actually speak into the mic when you do speak, so that everybody who's in the viewing audience can pick it up?
Edward Luce, the Financial Times bureau chief in Washington.
Michael Brooks, and I blog and podcast for Liberal Oasis.
I'm Tom Garofalo, and I'm working with the New America Foundation on their U.S.-Cuba Policy Initiative and blogging at the Havana Note.
Michael Walsh. I'm a project director at Forum One Communications in Alexandria, Virginia.
Hi, John Ward, White House reporter for the new website, The Daily Caller. How you doing, Steve?
Great. I look forward to writing for the Daily Caller.
Andrew Lebovich. I work for the American Strategy Program here and also occasionally blog for the Washington Note.
Daniel Halper. I'm with the Foreign Policy Initiative and occasionally contribute to the Weekly Standards blog.
I'm Ted Alden. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm working mostly on Homeland Security and visa policy issues.
Thanks. And just before Raoul and Martin start, I'm going to do a brief introduction of both of them. I'm not going to do them justice in terms of their resumes, but I'm going to just briefly highlight some things. For Martin, Martin joined the British Council as assistant rep in Beijing in 1984, when the British Council in China had an operation of 6 people, and I love this, worked in a converted bicycle shed at the British Embassy, which sounds more like an intelligence operation. Martin played a role then in changing that presence up to its present strength of more than 230 people in 4 state-of-the-art offices. And I think British Council's overseas network extends now to 233 locations in 107 countries and territories. And Raoul is actually a trustee with the British Council, and I'm sure he can explain to us the role he plays with the Council, but he's a non-executive director with it, but he's actually the CEO of Exposure, a company called Exposure, which is a multidisciplinary communications agency with over 150 employees in London, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and brings that expertise directly to the Council's work. So now I'll turn it over to Martin and Raoul to give us some brief comments, and then we can start a conversation.
Amjad and Steve, thank you very much indeed, and just like to say thank you for putting this together. It's a real pleasure to have a conversation about the nature of this endeavour which we're engaged in, which we call cultural relations. And I think there's a difference between cultural relations and public diplomacy, but it is all aspects of smart power. And as Steve said, we were founded 75 years ago, very directly as an organisation to combat fascism in Europe. And it was very directly to try and create an alternative narrative of how societies and peoples should live with each other, in very sharp contrast to the narrative, and in many ways at that time, more attractive narrative, which fascism was actually creating in Europe. And in 1936, our then chairman, a man called William Tyrrell, appealed for the government to put substantial funds in on the back of the military build-up at that time. And what he said is, the organisation has to be seen as assisting practically in our national defence. Modern defence consists not only in arms, but in removing misunderstanding and promoting understanding. And in some senses, that sense of what we as an organisation are seeking to do is just as relevant and just as current today as it was back then. As an organisation, we, as you said, are about 7,500 staff spread across 100+ countries. We have a turnover of about $1 billion US, of which 320 million comes from the British government, and another 675 plus coming from other forms of income generating, including delivering English language services, giving examinations, working on development programs, and working in partnership with other organisations, including commercial organisations. And last year we engaged, by which we mean we had a direct one-to-one contact with over 13 million people around the world, and we had a reach of a further 221 million, by which we mean people with whom we have come into contact through broadcasting, development or use of our online media, and attendance at things like exhibitions and other events. We see cultural relations, which is what we believe we do, and we define that as building engagement and trust for the UK through the exchange of knowledge and ideas between people worldwide. And we're very, very clear that we are part of the UK's foreign policy apparatus. But we are part of that apparatus which has a very distinct position within that overall spectrum. The UK, like other major countries, operates an entire spectrum of foreign policy and international relations, all the way from aid right the way through to the deployment of hard power. But there is, within the very heart of that, we believe, a critical component which is about providing access and opportunity for people worldwide, about creating engagement and influence for the UK through dialogue. And I think the things which we believe make us a particularly strong and effective organisation are, first of all, our arm's length from government. We do things which governments can't do. And there are examples of that which we may want to come back to. Secondly, that our work is informed by the issue of dialogue and engagement, not through the issue of messaging or delivering a particular set of short-term foreign policy objectives on behalf of the government. And thirdly, that we operate within a very clear strategic framework, which is long-term, slow burn, but is delivering the influence through that dialogue with peoples right around the world, which governments can exercise and use at points when that's needed within the short-term foreign policy agendas. I think the final thing I would say is, as an organisation, clearly we have to define where we're going to focus ourselves geographically. You can't do everything everywhere all at the same time. And the sort of priorities we place are on new economies and new markets, India and China the most obvious ones, on what we would regard as the trust deficit countries, those countries where the UK has the greatest gap in trust, and those are the very obvious ones of Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, across the Middle East and in parts of South Asia, and on isolated countries like Burma and Zimbabwe, where we believe we deliver a lifeline of access for young people. One of the things I'm very proud of is that we have 250,000 people every year going through our offices in Burma. And the only place, I think, where you can reasonably get free access to internet, international media, anywhere in the country. And of course, we are also working closely with partners in the developed countries, because I think the agendas which we are pursuing are ones which we share with countries across Western Europe, with the United States, with other countries, and we're increasingly looking to ask the question, how do we actually operate in partnership rather than in competition? We don't actually see this agenda as one where it is a zero-sum game where one country wins and another loses, but actually the agendas we're working on ones which need to be a partnership one. So perhaps I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this roundtable for us. As mentioned earlier, my name is Raoul Shah. I'm a trustee of the British Council. I joined the Board of Trustees a year ago, so it's a 3-year term. And what that fundamentally means is that I act as a non-executive director overseeing the governance of the organisation, the programmes that we deliver around the world. It also gives me the kind of, I guess, privilege to be relatively independent of the day-to-day nuances of how the operations run, so I can come in with slightly more objective views around what we do, what we stand for, and who we influence. My own background is, 20 years of working in sort of commercial and for commercial organisations in the sort of marketing, communications, and creative space, and hopefully that's kind of where I have brought some, alternative ways to address the future of our organisation in terms of how we embrace new channels, new technology, particularly digital, and how we kind of make our relationships with the commercial sector work more effectively and harder for us. And Steve, I'm glad you noticed a tie, because it makes a rare outing, and this is one of the special occasions I wore it. So I was quite happy to hear that you noticed a sort of smart attire around the table. Next time,
I definitely am not wearing a tie.
I noticed. I wasn't sure if it was just a video of a screen, but actually I like the casual approach.
Well, I want to thank everyone. I just saw Patrick Cronin come in. I don't know if others have come in. I was just reading Patrick's thoughts about the Afghanistan war that his organization, the Center for New American Security, and actually it was not on the war, it was on Obama's speech. But I thought, just to start off with discussion rather than just pose a question to Martin, is I'd love to draw Ed Luce into this at the very beginning. I haven't prepped him on this, but when you think about the fact that you guys are wedged deeply into the priorities of the British government, as we think on the U.S. side, how to deal with cultural positioning around the world, cultural bridge building, how it fits into smart power, I think there's a legitimate debate whether the American government brand helps or hurts in that process, whether you work with somewhat non-government looking like organizations that have an arm's length distance, and how you begin from parts of the world where you're already well positioned to parts of the world where you're not. And Martin, I know you were in Lahore recently. You've done reports on Pakistani youth and your concerns about the demographic dimensions there. But before you comment, I'd like to ask Ed, who's living in Washington and has watched the British Council's activities around the world, particularly in India and South Asia. What would be your friendly or not friendly critique of the British Council, and what advice would you have for Americans engaged in this?
Thanks, Steve. Well, I guess the first thing I thought when I saw your email about British smart power was this was a mistake. This was an oxymoron, because I don't often associate the word smart with recent use of British power. In terms of your direct question, I've had a lot of experience with the British Council, not so much in this country, but in India, where, as you said, I was based for 5 years. And it's a delight to hear. I haven't tracked you very closely, but it's a delight to hear that you're still expanding, because the impression that I got in India was whenever you closed a library. I remember once in Lucknow, the capital of Uttar Pradesh, I think the British Council closed a library, and it caused huge sort of cries of anguish. It was a media issue for months, because so many people relied upon that library, to introduce them to the world's literature. And I guess what you were doing was investing in new technology and making budgetary decisions. But it was a real measure, I felt, of just how embedded an institution it was within Indian culture and elsewhere. The point I would make, a very untutored point, in response to your question, Steve, about what Americans can usefully learn from British smart power. It's still difficult to juxtapose those two words. British smart power institutions, such as the British Council, and I think the BBC World Service Radio, is that if you go to Kashmir, for example, to pick one example, probably Kosovo, but I'm not as familiar with it, and you talk to people and you ask them what radio they listen to, international radio they listen to, they'll say the World Service. If you ask them about Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, they'll generally say they don't listen to it. And when you ask why, a very big difference in perception comes out, that the World Service is seen as independent. It's not seen as a direct organ of the British government's views of the world. Whereas the state-sponsored American media outlets are seen, and I think they are required under law, to provide the American case, which taints them. Now, whether the fact that the British Council is able to maintain this arm's length detachment from the government whilst being funded quite heavily by the government because of some peculiar institutional a British way of doing things that just isn't present in the far more legalistic American way of doing things, I don't know. But it's a question, in fact, I'd like to throw to both of you. There clearly is a very different way of approaching state-run cultural organizations between the two countries.
I think that's absolutely right, and we would draw a very clear parallel between the editorial independence of the BBC World Service and what we would call the operational independence of the British Council, and the trust that the World Service engenders because of that editorial independence does have a direct mirror with the trust which I think we as an organisation have through our operational independence. And one example which might help illustrate it, I was recently in Cairo at Al-Azhar University, which is as I'm sure you know, the longest extant university in the world, a huge, something like 40,000 students studying largely Muslim theology. And we, at the request of that university, have developed an English language program for them to provide opportunity for their students to not simply learn English language, but actually to engage with the rest of the world. And talking to the senior officials in that university, it's very clear what they're looking for. They're looking for the opportunity for their brightest young undergraduates to actually simply engage with the rest of the world in a way which they can't, because up to now they haven't had the language to be able to do that. And to be able to express their views, their opinions, within a cultural format which is understandable to others. Because what language does, it doesn't simply give you the linguistic ability to have a conversation. It actually allows you to understand in a whole host of different ways how to actually engage and argue and discuss and have a dialogue with others. And that was something which the president of the university was looking for. But it was also absolutely clear that was not a program he would be prepared to do with a government and a government organisation. So that ability to recognise the British Council as, we're an official organisation, but we are not part of the government, and we're not part of the short-term immediate messaging that governments quite rightly engage in, is absolutely critical for them to be for that university to be prepared to accept and work with us as an organisation. And when I was talking to them a couple of weeks ago, they're now talking about how they might extend that program into their 50,000 secondary schools across the Middle East. So these things can have a serious and important knock-on effect. But for me, what was interesting about that was both the fact that they were prepared to work with us, but secondly, how they saw of giving their students the opportunity to have an international engagement.
Can I just add as well that from an independent perspective versus a kind of government alignment perspective, what I've seen, which has been really interesting, is our ability to implement on the ground and actually make programs come to life. And Martin referenced the kind of role of engagement and influence in our organisation. That, I think, is where we separate the line between messaging and kind of influence from a government/senior perspective versus the influence you have on young people at a kind of grassroots level. And I think the British Council's ability to actually do a lot of programs where in terms of one-to-one engagement, the numbers sort of speak for themselves. I think that's where the evaluation of our role and our independence from government becomes much more potent, because people actually see the value of our ability to take a high-level strategy and bring it right down to influencing individuals around the world. And I think that kind of separates, again, and provides a very credible line between the influence of government.
If you don't mind, Amjad, I would like to draw Patrick Cronin into the conversation to get his thoughts on this broad question of smart power. Some time ago, Patrick and I were sitting in Doha, and he was being told by Central Command, essentially, that they wouldn't take care of him if he went over in Afghanistan. And he was lamenting at the moment the way in which, in some of these places in which we needed to do bridge building and get people out there, not only to analyze the situation, but to develop relationships, that we continually find ourselves, on the U.S. side of this, putting ourselves behind a wall. I'd love to draw Patrick into this and maybe get another viewpoint from our friend from the Foreign Policy Initiative, and then Amjad, maybe you can bring in some people I can't see there, but I specifically wanted to ask Patrick, who's very thoughtful on these issues.
And what is the question? The question is, I can obviously talk about what Steve is alluding to, in the fact that we don't even send our senior military officials, as a general rule, besides the chairman, to Yemen and Pakistan, two countries where we're most worried about radicalization, because it's too dangerous to send them. So we send them to everywhere where it's safe. I was a civilian, clearly, and here I had been asked to go to Pakistan to build those bridges, and then another part of the sort of Central Command on the ground suddenly thought it wasn't timely for me to be there, so they decided, no, we don't want to build that bridge. We run into lots of problems. But some of the challenges I'm thinking about right now is this elusive quest, the holy grail of comprehensive approaches, comprehensive power. Here in the United States, and in Washington in particular, we reduce all these good ideas to reductionist, almost technocratic vocational skills. So things like English language becomes strategic communications. We reduce it beyond the degree to which it can be useful anymore. So I don't want to be overly reductionist on this, but some of the questions I'm trying to think about is, how do we approach a regional problem? We know that we would like to strengthen country-team approaches just within the U.S. government. We know we need to internationalize it. We know, so when we looked at Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the FCO was imploring some of us to try to undertake a regional approach, it was too difficult for the U.S. government to do. We can go into that for days, but that's the basic problem. So how do we use soft power when we don't have it, and when those who have it aren't allowed to use it, or can't use it, or don't choose to use it? This is the challenge of the day. So I'm very much driven by this common need to. We're working at a time when in Washington we've got a great administration willing to think well beyond state-to-state relations to networking. Take Anne-Marie Slaughter's work as a foundation for this. But how do we make that realistic when it comes to questions of whether it's slow radicalization in some areas, or whether it's regional approaches where we're we're further destabilizing the region in the short term, if you will, in the hope that it'll lead to more stability in the longer term, through a comprehensive approach, so that it's not just a military approach. And what we saw last night from the President was an attempt, an honest attempt from an American president to try to rationalize just the difficult decisions he's had to make when he's looked at all sides of a story from different opinions, and he's tried to take what he thinks is the sensible approach in between these tough choices. That is, how does he go beyond McChrystal's purely military approach, because McChrystal was told, take a military approach, politics are not your lane. What's the political strategy? And we only got part of that answer yesterday, and part of it isn't meant for public consumption. So, but that's where the soft power will come in a very big way, because again, the economic strategies, development strategies, political strategies, and in many ways, those are the missing components in much of what we're doing. So we have lots of activity in Washington groups still around military activities that are not fully allowing a comprehensive approach. And we're not alone. I don't find anybody in the world persuasively teaching me how to do a successful regional strategy or comprehensive approach. I met with the Chinese this morning. They have their approaches, but it's all unilateral. They're successful at regional approaches, if you will, but they don't necessarily work easily with others. Steve, I don't know if that begins to join this discussion or whether I've taken you in different directions.
No, I think that's terrific. I'd love to hear from our friend from FBI, but Martin, as you think about the role and success of the British Council and some of the deficits that Patrick Cronin just outlined, and John Ward and others may have some thoughts about this, just kind of bluntly, what, given your experience and expertise, and the U.S. government is talking to you folks, what do you think we're missing in our game plan? And I think that's really what Patrick was getting at. But can we talk to our friend from FBI and then have reaction from Martin, and then Amjad, you involve those people who look raring to get out of their seats on this.
Actually, Steve, if you wouldn't mind, can I let Martin answer it first so I can sort of respond? I'm more curious to hear what he has to say than...
You bet. You do not have to be controlled by me from Berlin.
Thank you for that, Dan. I suppose a couple of thoughts going through my mind as you were speaking. I think it's worth just quoting Admiral Mullen when he said, only through a shared appreciation of people's culture, needs and hopes for the future can we hope ourselves to supplant the extremist narrative. And he goes on to talk about being unable to capture hearts and minds. We need to engage them. And I think that's very much the approach which we would recognise and we would see huge value in. I think there's a serious problem in thinking about all engagement as about strategic communications, because it is, by its very definition, a one-way directive approach, and that the approach around dialogue requires it is much harder, it is much longer term, it's much slower burn, and the huge problem we all have is it's much more difficult to be able to demonstrate the impact of that over the sort of short-term political timelines which we're constantly working with, whether that is for treasuries and ministries of finance or the broader political space. So you're constantly having to look back over the past and say, well, it worked then, so why should it not work now? And in some senses, the heyday of the approach was very much in the lead up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and indeed the approach which was taken in Europe by the UK in terms of bringing the new democracies, the new countries of Eastern Europe into a closer form of dialogue, which eventually led to accession to the European Union. So there are examples in the past, but it's always within a context which is different, and that difference sometimes gets in the way. I think that there is clearly a need to constantly be trying to build that entire spectrum of international intervention, so that the aid agenda marries up with the public diplomacy and the messaging agenda, which of course does still have to be there, which marries up with the influencing and dialoguing agenda. And I suppose that what I would say is what we are attempting to do, and I think with some success, is to create an environment which allows those messages to land. The conversation we were having a few minutes ago, the extraordinary power of the President and the Secretary of State. They are able to speak in a way which attracts massive attention. But the real question is the ground actually prepared adequately for what they're saying to land in a way that they actually intend? And what happens after they've spoken? So you've got these big high peaks of really outstanding dialogue and engagement. But what comes before to allow those messages to land, and what comes afterwards, which reinforces them through a constant engagement with the people with whom you're discussing? And that seems to me to be the critical agenda we're constantly working on. How do you not how do you deliver and exercise that influence, but how do you actually create an environment which allows influence to be exercised when the need is there?
I think to rephrase your point, and which I agree with, is sort of a matter of effectiveness, right? So we can try a lot of things, but is it being effective? So how does this get done? I mean, if for instance, in Jordan, for instance, if USAID is assisting every single health clinic, but at the end they put on a plaque that says, all sponsored by the USAID, is that helping America, or is that hurting America? And these are sort of further questions that are culturally sensitive and perhaps country specific, and so I do wonder how that's being approached, and moreover, I also wonder what the approach towards Iran is, and sort of how nimble can something like the Council be, and how quickly can they provide aid when people protest and are sort of seeking support from an outside source. And so those are some of my questions.
And that's actually an excellent question about Iran, because your offices recently they were shut down, right?
They were, yeah. Could I just come back before I talk about Iran to that question around the plaque? I think, again, putting up the plaque is an entirely legitimate thing to do, but only if it's within a broader context of engagement. So the support you put into medical centres across Jordan, fantastically important. But what else is going on which actually helps that be within a context which people see as positive, not as interventionist or negative? One example that I was looking at in Pakistan when I was there 10 days ago, Mirpur, which is part of Kashmir, Azad Kashmir, which is where the vast bulk of British Pakistanis come from, is a really very important place for us to build a stronger sense of trust and engagement. Now, we have a whole set of programs. We have school links, and we have English language teaching and support services, and we have programs which help create community engagement for young people. All those issues which our report on Pakistan demonstrate or sort of showed were critical issues for them. But really, in a place like Mirpur, it's about how do you actually take these various interventions and bring them together into something which is coherent, which, given the sort of resources we have available to us, is always going to be a pilot rather than a huge deliverer of impact. But then how do you actually engage and involve the local authorities so they pick up and begin to build on those set of interventions? And that's what we're seeking to do in Mirpur. So we're bringing together, we're focusing on the under 25 young population who have a massive problem in terms of the quality of education they've got and the sense of opportunity that they have, and we are focusing on providing them with support through the public education system on learning English, on developing skills through active citizenship and community leadership to provide employment opportunities for their own people, and also to create contacts with some of the relatives back in the UK through a whole series of active links. And that combination of activities, if we can actually get, which we are now getting the local authorities to also put the resources in, you're actually beginning to build an agenda which is responding very directly to some of the issues which those young people have raised. Going on to Iran, as you know, we weren't actually ordered to close in Iran, but our staff in Iran were ordered to resign from the organisation. So much the same thing, really.
You were thrown out of Russia, though, weren't you?
No, not completely. We were ordered to close our offices in Ekaterinburg and St. Petersburg. We're still present in Moscow and still active there. But nonetheless, yes, we had serious issues in Russia as well. What was happening in Iran, I think, was really very interesting, because I think it demonstrates both the power and also some of the problems which cultural relations brings. Iran has this extraordinary, young, talented, well-educated, urban population, which has a huge hunger for all sorts of involvement with the outside world, whether that is through internet, blogging, IT engagement, examinations, use of language, education links, etc., etc. And essentially what we were doing as an organisation was providing some of those inputs. So we were working on examinations, because young Iranians were wanting to be able to evidence in their education qualifications within recognised international setup. We were working on English language. We were working on university-to-university links. And in some senses, I suppose that was indeed what the authorities in Iran were finding most difficult to accept. And the pressure for us to pull back and adjust and desist from some of this activity was not simply over a few weeks. It was actually over many months, which culminated in our closure in January. And the question we have to constantly ask ourselves is, we have this huge demand, pent-up demand coming out of Iran for these sorts of activities. So what are the alternative ways that we might be able to deliver them, recognising that we probably won't be opening up offices in Tehran in the immediate future? And it's about working with other partners and other organisations. So we are, for example, working with the Iranian organisation on delivering the examinations into Iran, and there are something like 22,000 of those being delivered this year. We are working with the BBC World Service on putting together a course on English specifically aimed at Iran. And we're working with various British education institutions to help them develop their links separate from us. And what's important is that we abstract ourselves and our name from some of these activities, because it gets in the way. So better to be not right up there in your face about it, but allowing the work to go on. And if it has to be done through other organisations and other people, then so be it, as long as we're actually delivering services and connections which people there are looking for.
Steve, if I could, I want to ask Karen a question, also because, Karen, you're with Al-Hudra. And one of the arguments that we have in the United States is whether we have an image problem in I like the term trust deficit countries. So America has lots of trust deficit countries. And the argument we have is whether it's an image problem or whether it's a policy problem. And in either case, we've had the advantage that for a long time, it seems that the majority of people in the Arab world or in the Muslim world disaggregated American policy from America. So even though they hated American policy on any particular issue, say Israel or the war in Iraq, they disaggregated that from America. They still loved America. They still loved Americans. Now, in the last several years, over the last 8 maybe or 10, it seems that that's begun to fudge, that people are beginning to associate the policy with the people or the policy with the country. And I wanted to know, if, in your experience, if you thought that that was true. And I wanted to take it to a question to Raoul and Martin concerning what Patrick said about a comprehensive strategy. If that is true, what needs to be done? What does a public diplomacy 2.0 look like? Now, when it's been used here, when Glassman, the previous Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, used it, he meant strategic communications. I mean, he narrowed it. He didn't widen it. He didn't mean it to be a comprehensive thing. He meant it to be a more narrow thing. You mentioned, Raoul, in a conversation we had before we started, digital 2.0, using maybe new techniques, etc. I'd like to hear from both of you in terms of substance and in terms of mechanism, what you think a 2.0 strategy for the Council should look like, and maybe by extension what it could look like for the United States. But I'd like first to hear from Karen if you think, first of all, am I on base that that line between the disaggregation of the things we hate about American policy, but we love America,
Right.
if that's begun to change?
Well, we still see an awful lot of things about America and Americans that people in the Middle East still love. Clearly, they love the music, they love the technology, the cell phones, any type of electronic type things. We find that is one of the things that they view on our network the most. Certainly, the policy is something that we're still working on. They're not, across the board, people are very skeptical. And I think they have reason to be skeptical. What we do is we do predominantly Middle East type news, and we also add into it some either American perspective, American guests, people, so that each newscast has some sort of American perspective. I think we've been hugely busy yesterday and today dealing with President Obama's speech and having people come on and comment about that. And that's how sort of we finagle, if you will, adding a bit more of the American perspective. It's certainly debatable how much of it is actually, how well each of it is being received. And I personally think at Al-Thora we need to do a better job with our public diplomacy efforts. I really do. As Martin was saying earlier, as we were talking earlier, talking about healthcare, I think we could do an awful lot more at our network on healthcare and showing how we here in America, what we do to help people. We could be bringing people over here for their services, and we could be, I know there are doctors who are trained here, doctors from the Middle East who are trained here in the United States and go back and do their work. And
we can hear you typing.
You're doing the transcript.
Are you taking notes of what
I am, Karen. It's really telling what you're saying. Need to do a better job.
Yes, we do. I hope I'm being authorized to say all these things too. I hope tomorrow I still have a job. No, but I think in general, I think we could be doing a better job in the public diplomacy efforts. I think, healthcare diplomacy or anything of that nature is always something that no matter where anybody lives, it's a huge success when we show what we have in common, more what we have in common than what we have that is people dislike about each other, such as religion. So I think if we took the time to focus a whole lot more on things like healthcare, in particular, as I was starting to say, I know that the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota brings doctors over from the Middle East. They help train them and update their skills and with the technology, and particularly in cardiology and things of that nature. And then they go back to the Middle East and they begin to practice what they've learned here in the United States. I think if we followed them with a camera crew, coming here and updating their services, their medical skills, I think that's an area that I think would be widely received, highly received by majority of people, and I think people need to learn about. These doctors are doing these sorts of treatments, and I think it's a great thing for people to learn that it is available, perhaps not in their backyards, but certainly relatively available for folks out there. So that's something I personally would like to see changed.
I'd like to sort of get Raoul to talk a little bit about sort of digital cultural relations, but before he does, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things you said, Karen. I think there is evidence that, and it's true for the UK as well as for the US, that ability of people, particularly in the Middle East, to be able to distinguish between country and policy is narrowing. But I do think we tend to overemphasize how much it is narrowing. And I think the United States remains a phenomenally attractive society for people right across the world. And in some senses, it's probably rude to say so, but you actually have to try really hard to dissuade people of that. I think there are all these extraordinarily attractive aspects of society in the US, and I think also in the UK, which we really can build on. But I think one of the critical things, when we talk about dialogue, we still tend to think in terms of trying to build people to get people so they agree with us. I think dialogue is actually about celebrating difference as much as it is about trying to create consensus. And anything which forces people away from disagreement towards some sort of false consensus, I think, ends up being negative. You're not going to get people from very different cultures with very different societies to agree on some fundamental issues, nor do we actually need to for us to be able to have a positive engagement with them. In fact, by recognizing that disagreement and the difference and sort of putting it up there as something for us to face up to, I think that leads us into a much stronger sense of dialogue than constantly trying to search for this consensus or this agree with me type of approach.
Absolutely, and I think that's why I feel so strongly about using medicine as a type of dialogue, because it is something that has a very broad consensus. And it's something that we can do. It's already in place. We are doing things now. We just need to highlight this more than what we are doing, and I think that's an important part.
Amjad, if I may, I notice we have about 14 minutes left before our friends rush out. I'd love to just make sure that we get, a bundle of John Ward, of anybody else who'd like to comment, and if others have come in who aren't visible on the screen, give them a chance to put their stuff on the table so that Raoul and Martin can at least respond or react.
Yeah, we're going to make sure we do that. I'm just going to ask Raoul to talk a little bit about Digital 2.0, which is an idea he's been working on.
Great, thank you. And just, to pick up on both the points made earlier by Karen and Martin, I mean, dialogue is key, and I think in terms of central to our strategy around sort of Digital 2.0, it's really, for an organisation that's 75 years old, it's quite difficult to kind of embrace new technologies. I was jokingly talking about my father's ability and use of a mobile phone, kind of forgetting to take it with him when he leaves the house. And, that's a very real challenge for organisations to change, especially on a global scale, not just on a regional scale. And for us, Digital 2.0 is driven by insights around what, drives the future of organisations like ours, which are young people. And if we can tap into kind of relevant conversations, relevant subjects, you talk about, what people aspire to when they talk about America, music and all sorts of other things. I think becoming part of the dialogue is ultimately about finding what, the touch points are for young people to want to participate in conversations that they are already having. So it's not about saying, come and listen to us because we've got something better to say. Digital has freed the world up to communicate, express themselves, and be free of editing and control. And I think for us, our organisation has to have a presence online where we're less of a shop window and less of a great-looking website, and more a place for conversations to be engaging people all over the world. That needs bravery because we've got to be transparent and we've got to be prepared for what transparency brings with it. I think we have to facilitate and not intervene with our strategy. And I think, as I said, going to the sort of energy centres around what is on the agenda of young people is probably the quickest win opportunity to insert ourselves into conversations. I mean, we talk a lot about how our brands, how our clients can become part of someone else's agenda. And if it's done successfully, you become a brand that is part of a never-ending conversation. And I think that's the ultimate sort of holy grail for any brand, any organisation. And I think about the council as a brand, less of just this kind of entity that's kind of out there doing things. And when I apply my kind of brand filters to the British Council, I do think, what are we going to do through the digital space and the digital opportunity that presents itself to become a never-ending conversation? And that conversation will not be driven just by us. It will be driven by the world outside that is engaging in their own conversations around our activities.
Well, now why don't we do what Steve just said, and those of you who haven't had a chance yet, maybe raise some issues and comments.
Just remember the microphones.
Yeah, and remember the microphones.
I guess I'll start off. I actually just have a quick question, which is, to what extent do you engage British immigrant communities in your outreach efforts? Because it seems to me that one of the big advantages that the United States and Britain have in this sort of public diplomacy is we have people in our countries who look like everybody in the world. Mm-hmm. And that engaging those communities in an outreach effort is likely to be a lot more successful than, say, you and I going out and leading an outreach effort. So just interested in how much effort you put into trying to take advantage of those diaspora.
And for the viewers online, that's Ted Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah, why don't we go around and get some more comments, and then we'll let Martin and Raoul address all of them.
And identify yourself for those watching online. We've got quite a big audience online.
John Ward, Daily Caller. I'll be quick. Patrick, you said something that I wanted to follow up on, which is you said that smart power is not being used. Is that correct? But people who have smart power capability are not using it?
They don't have the opportunity to fully use it.
Okay. I wanted to just draw out why that is. He said that people don't have the opportunity to do that. You would seem to know from a governmental perspective why that is. Some thoughts came to mind in my own head just about cultural attitudes, because that might work against smart power being used. Because when we talk about winning hearts and minds, that's a popular concept. Everybody says, yeah, let's do that. But we've seen very little progress in the Middle East on that front. As a counterpoint, the idea of dialogue seems to be losing cachet in my mind. And one of the things that I thought might contribute to this is that we're in a increasingly digital age, obviously. And in the age of Google, everything needs to be quantified. As you said, Martin, it's hard to quantify results here. In the internet age, everything needs to be immediate, which is also hard here. So those are just some of the thoughts that came into my mind as to why it might be, why the idea of dialogue. I mean, President Obama right now is getting a lot of criticism for dialogue not paying off on foreign policy. Those are just some of my thoughts. But I would like to hear from you, Patrick, why people are not able to practice smart power.
Well, accepting the term smart power, not going against the grain, there are myriad reasons why the U.S. government makes it very difficult to employ a venue, a vehicle, in which you can incorporate even the civilian agencies of government. Forget about civil society. Now, it doesn't mean there are not successes as well, but I'm looking at the hard problems, and I'm wondering whether we're effectively able to mobilize and create the networks that we need to use a lot of, especially non-military instruments of power, to, say, prevent conflict. And whether you're looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, talk about slow burn. I mean, it's the slow resource exploitation. Everybody's there, and it's still failing. We've been in Afghanistan for 8 years, and it's still going in the wrong direction. Obviously, our strategy could be wrong. Our means may be insufficient. But clearly, we're not providing an ability to mobilize all the available actors internationally in a regional context. When we do things in the U.S. government on a regional level successfully, the only platform we have for doing that is a regional combatant command. Immediately, the word combatant interferes with some of the softer, smarter tools that we may have. And no matter how well-meaning the military may be, and they are, we have some very bright leaders, people like General Petraeus, who really understand the need to do this, you end up having to fit diplomacy and development into a military campaign plan, which has much more to do with where do you move the chess pieces over the next 6 months than it does how do you have the effect of the traction, say, for communications, for a message, to be well received, to create a relationship, not to agree, but even to find out where you disagree, and to find mutual respect, and to find that you have a common stake, whether it's in healthcare, in issues, you actually have a common humanity. Not to get too philosophical about policy, where there's very little room for philosophy, but you have a common stake in these issues. I don't find those things easily done inside the U.S. government, and I don't find them done in other governments either, but since I focus heavily on trying to make U.S. government better, all of these reviews that this administration is undertaking, whether it's the Quadrennial Defense Review, the first ever Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, the President's Review of Development Policy, and other reviews that are backing up, they're all going to lead to some synthesis here in 2010, including the new national security strategy. Well, prepare to be underwhelmed despite the best intentions of a lot of very, very smart people, a lot of friends of mine, a lot of them British trained and educated. Despite that, we can't take the hurdle. We're not able to move into this new paradigm, whether it's, digital 2.0 is one aspect of that, one manifestation of this sort of new paradigm, where you're able to create a platform to get beyond state-to-state relations and allow both state-to-state relations and an ability for civil society, non-state actors, transnational actors, global actors to bring to bear solutions and commitments and capabilities to these complex and sometimes wicked problems. It's obviously complex, and I haven't done a very good job of explaining, but those are some of the ideas rattling around in my old brain.
Thanks, Patrick. And Amjad, I know you're going to jump in there, but I also want to be right on time. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I do want to give an opportunity to Martin Davidson to have a wrap-up time. But Ted Alden put something very important on the table. We did one of these forums long distance, and ironically, I was in Berlin then as well with David Miliband in that office. And at the time, Peter Bergen and others had written about, the issue of sort of unreached communities inside Britain that were finding themselves seduced by Islamic radicalism, and this spoke to a need within Britain to reach out to these communities. I think it's a very interesting question, and I wonder at all if the British Council is engaged in that. This is a very big issue here in Germany as well, and obviously a big issue in France with the internal dimensions of cultural distance. And would love any thoughts as you wrap up, and if anybody wants to throw something in real quick, but our hard end time is in 4 minutes.
Yeah, I can interject one thing before we close. Being an industry and working on Gov 2.0 and Digital 2.0, if you phrased it, we can see that the digital age is both disruptive and transformative to public diplomacy. And it's leading to a proliferation in the number of actors who are actually participating in public diplomacy. You're seeing IGOs and NGOs start to enter the field. You're seeing countries which traditionally haven't been engaged in public diplomacy now conducting public diplomacy. And it's not just outbound, it's also inbound for the countries that were doing public diplomacy. And responding to that is going to be very important. You've also seen a proliferation in broadband and mobile penetration, and you've seen a change in the actual technology, social media, social networking, and all of that, which is enabling a move from broadcasting to conversations to collaboration. And so I would love to hear thoughts, either now or later about, how this is going to impact the policies of both the United States and Britain with respect to public diplomacy.
Can I just say thank you for what I think has been a really fascinating conversation. Just a few thoughts to try and wrap up in our last few minutes. Just dealing with Ted's comments around the diaspora communities. It is a vitally important component of any public diplomacy agenda and cultural relations agenda for the UK. And as David Miliband, I think, said, there is a great deal of concern about the potential radicalisation of communities within the UK and how one deals with that. And certainly in our work, I have to say that this is an area which is relatively new for us. It's probably only been for 5 or 6 years we've really begun to identify the diaspora communities as groups that we really need to become much better involved and engaged with. And one of the ways in which we're doing that is, so for example, our School Links program, which is quite deliberately intended over a 3 to 4 year period to ensure that every school in the UK has some sort of international link as part of it, the education offer it makes to those children. And many of those schools do have very, very heavy diaspora community enrolments. And so it's inevitable those will have a link into, if you like, the ancestral home of some of those young people. But it's very important that we don't limit it to that. One of the things that was said to me recently in India, when we were talking about precisely this thing, the people with whom I was having the conversation said, don't just link us with Indian diaspora communities, because we actually need something much wider. And that's equally true for the diaspora communities in the UK. If they're seen as simply an offshoot of their ancestral home rather than part of a wider community, we're going to both fail them and their aspirations, and we're going to fail the connections we're making in their home countries or in their ancestral countries. So it's, I think, critically important. And I suppose it goes down to the core philosophy, which is if we're going to be truly effective as an organisation, we have to reflect the total complexity of the society in the country from which we spring, and that includes all those diaspora communities in both the positive and potentially some of the negative aspects of that. But I don't think it is simply about linking Pakistani heritage young people with Pakistan. That's too crude, too simplistic, and I think doesn't actually deliver what those communities are actually looking for, important though it is. I think, just picking up on some of the things Patrick was saying, the huge problem we've got is this demand that we find simple solutions to complex problems, and those simple solutions have got to deliver in a matter of months, not a matter of years and indeed generations. I was accused once by quite a well-known journalist in the UK of sending troops underneath the barbed wire waving copies of Shakespeare. It was a good line, but you know, and if we're not really careful, it is very easy to be portrayed as trying to do that. So there's a space which different forms of action hold, and it's about being really clear about what you can do with different types of activity. And it was something of a truism a couple of years ago, which I think probably has slipped a little bit from the dialogue at the moment, is that the role of the military is to hold a space to allow other actors to engage, whether that is aid, whether that is the development of civil society, whether it's development of community and community engagement. All of those things need to take place, but military action in and of itself, well, it can only do a part of the job. But I think the huge problem we have is, can we actually take the time which is needed to actually be effective in this? And it would be a huge mistake to think that any public diplomacy or cultural relations agenda is going to solve all the problems. They're a contributor. They're not a solution in and of themselves.
Well, thank you, Martin. And I just want to say a quick word of thanks to you and Raoul and Martin for doing this with us, and thank all of my friends in the blogging, new media, old media, and ideas arenas here in Washington for joining us and for allowing me to play a more active role than most in a virtual way from Berlin. Ed Luce wore a tie. I feel really guilty. It's kind of what Raoul was talking about. He never wears ties. This looks great on TV or on video from long away, but next time we'll have to get everybody in brighter shirts. But all that aside, I really appreciate the quality of discourse and discussion. I don't know, I see other people on the side that we may not have been able to build in, but on my behalf, I want to thank Amjad Attallah for being the animator of this on the ground, and Ben Catcher and Stephanie Gunter. And I don't know if Andrew Neal is there from the British Council. All of you who don't know him locally should meet him. He does an outstanding job for the British Council here in town. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much.